Professor Anthony Redmond from United Kingdom, who would lecture on preparation prior to frontline deployment. He authored the book Frontline, Saving Lives in War, Disaster and Disease. One of the reviewers introduced the book telling one heroic doctor unflinchingly honest and visceral account of the impossible ethical choices required by medical emergencies. Dr. David Knott, author of The War Doctor, introduced Professor Redmond as a true humanitarian. He is indeed a true humanitarian. Professor Redmond is Emeritus Professor of Emergency Medicine at King's University and Professor of International Emergency Medicine at University of Manchester. He has been involved in international emergency humanitarian assistance for almost 25 years, organizing and leading medical support to the natural disasters such as earthquakes in Armenia, Iran, Pakistan, and China, to mention few. He involved in major incidences in Lockerbie air disaster, UN air crash in Kosovo, and conflict in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and complex emergencies such as establishing a hospital in Iran and Iraq border to cater Kurdish refugees. So over to you, Professor Redmond, to discuss about the preparation prior to the frontline deploying.
I'd like to speak to you about how I and my team prepare ourselves as civilian humanitarian teams going into disasters, but also into conflict zones and into wars. Is tell you about my experience, discuss humanitarianism and what is meant by that and how that applies within conflict zones, the concept of standards within humanitarian healthcare, how these have been addressed by WHO in the what are called the blue and now the red books, and some thoughts on civilian and military collaboration. So first of all, my experience. I am an emergency physician by background. I did train in surgery. I also trained in internal medicine, and I have qualifications in both medicine and surgery. But as an emergency physician, I set up a pre-hospital care team in Manchester called the South Manchester Accident Rescue Team, which was initially to provide care to support the emergency and rescue services in and around the Manchester area. But in 1988, we were asked by the British government to take our team to then what was one of the largest sudden onset disasters of the 20th century, that is the earthquake in Armenia, which I wrote about in the British Medical Journal. And then on the way back from Armenia, we were diverted to provide medical care at the Lockerbie air disaster. And it was really a retrieval process to retrieve a large number of dead bodies. So in the space of 1 month in the late 1980s, I had gone to the largest sudden onset disaster of the 20th century, probably, or certainly one of them, and the largest act of terrorism on British soil. So I transformed my approach to emergency medicine, and I expanded the work of the South Manchester Accident Rescue Team enormously to make it a national team. And we then took the team to an earthquake in Iran in 1990 as a much expanded team. And following that, we set up a field hospital on the Iran-Iraq border, as you've heard about. And then we expanded our team further, and these are just a number of the large-scale humanitarian emergencies that we have responded to over the years. And during that time, as we became a national team, we evolved from being a South Manchester Accident Rescue Team to the UK Med team. But in 1992 to 1996, we were asked by the British government to provide medical support to Sarajevo during the civil war in Bosnia. I also worked for WHO in Bosnia at that time, setting up the WHO office. And that was a very different experience for myself and for us as a civilian team. And it was my introduction to providing humanitarian assistance during a war. Following on from going to Sarajevo, I then moved on with NATO as a civilian and working with the UN to support the restoration of healthcare services in Kosovo. To give you some flavor of what it was like as a civilian working in these combat zones. In Sarajevo, for example, we were subject to sniper fire all the time. Both the press and civilians were not considered neutral at all, and we were all targets. I was shot at many times. I had some very close encounters. Once I left the car door open and at night, and the light was on, and I went back to the car foolishly, thinking that the battery would go down, and it was very cold Sarajevo winter, and the sniper shot at the light. And I heard it go over my head and it hit the car roof, but fortunately I survived it. And there were many similar encounters. Also in Kosovo, the hospital, when we arrived there was still fighting going on between the Albanians and the Serbs. As the Serbs left, they turned off all the power. Bodies were liquefied in the mortuary. There were packs of feral wild dogs eating human remains in the hospital grounds. And most alarmingly, apart from there being gunfights in the emergency department, I was asked to cope with a patient, a Serb patient, who had been shot by a civilian who had been shot by Albanians in her own home. She came in alive, but refused to be operated upon by the Albanians in the hospital. And when we tried to convince her that she was bleeding out and needed surgery, she showed that under her clothes she had a hand grenade and was threatening to activate it. So we had to deal with that and disarm her at the same time as starting treatment. We did manage to do it all successfully, and we did damage limitation surgery in Kosovo and then transferred her to Belgrade, where she wanted to be treated, and her surgery was completed there. Another risk of working in combat zones for us all, but particularly for civilians who don't have the same protection as armed forces, was how do you get in and out? And we had to go in on the airlift, which everyone called maybe airlines, because maybe it would manage to take off and maybe it would land safely, because the airlift itself was a target for the Serb forces. I went in on the Italian airlift. Sorry, the slides do seem to be running on, but I'll try and catch up with them. I went in on the Italian airlift when I first went into Sarajevo. And then the next time the Italian airlift went into Sarajevo, it was shot down and all the crew were killed. I'd like to talk about humanitarianism, just so as though I'm sure those of you in the military are well aware of it, but it's worth reminding ourselves that certainly here in the West, it historically draws on the concept of compassion, individuality, and reform. And it's often the reform that we forget to implement. Why do people need humanitarian aid in the first place? Certainly here in the UK and across Europe, Wilberforce and the abolition of the slave trade in the early part of the 19th century developed the concept of humanitarianism, but it was Dunant in the mid-19th century with his foundation of the Red Cross that led to the Geneva Conventions and then ultimately to international humanitarian law. In practice, of course, humanitarianism is used to distinguish emergency aid from development aid, but at its heart, are the humanitarian principles, which were originally conceived of in the memory of Solferino by Henri Dunant, which you can download from the Red Cross website, which I would encourage you to do. But the humanitarian principles of humanity, and which was the founding principle, relieve suffering wherever it is found, but then also to remain neutral, to be impartial, and to be independent. And it is these other humanitarian principles that do create difficulties and conflicts within conflicts for those of us who are trying to act as humanitarians within a conflict zone, where remaining neutral and impartial and independent can be difficult, because armed forces are not independent, they are arms of their government. We as humanitarians try to be neutral and impartial, but as, for example, when I worked in Bosnia, the needs of one side were much greater than the other. And if you distribute aid numerically evenly, are you actually being impartial if you then try to give aid to where it's most needed? These are quite complex issues. Whilst we've been discussing history earlier, I would point out that when Henri Dunant founded the Red Cross and came up with this, that an organization providing aid on humanitarian grounds on a voluntary basis and funded by charity, she argued that it would actually make it easier for armies to carry on killing one another. And so she was not a proponent of this concept of humanitarianism, of relieving suffering wherever it was found, if it relieved those who were causing the suffering from the responsibility for dealing with it. It's not a view I share, but this concept of doing just what is right, doing good for its own sake and helping people is balanced by many against a more utilitarian, consequentialist approach. But what is the outcome? What difference does it make? In Bosnia, for example, the war in Sarajevo was prolonged, you might argue, because of the aid and support that was given. If you just looked at it in terms of how many people died, had no external aid gone in, then the Sarajevo would have collapsed, it would have been overrun, there would have been many people killed. But by giving external support to them, it went on very much longer and more people were killed. But many people would argue they are prepared to die for things, and it's not just saving lives that always matters. But these are things that we must consider and prepare ourselves for these arguments when we go into conflicts. There are moral and ethical issues that we all have to consider and decide what is right for us. I would also point out that Florence Nightingale, I'm sure, is familiar to all internationally as the lady with the lamp and who founded modern nursing, was also an early mathematician and statistician and popularized the use of pie charts. Moving on to standards. After the earthquake in Armenia, it was realized that there were an awful lot of medical and rescue teams that flooded in. Now we're going back to the late 1980s, and that although a lot of aid was given, it wasn't always well targeted. It wasn't always in response to what was actually needed. And so the UN set up the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team, UNDAC, of which I was a founder member. And the concept being that when a disaster occurs, the UN, if invited in by the host government, will send in a team to do an assessment, and then this assessment will be widely publicized, and aid can then be offered in response to identified needs. And also, it was noted that many teams went in describing themselves as search and rescue teams, but when they got there, they varied enormously between perhaps one man and a search dog and a large international fire and rescue team. And so the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group was set up to classify teams so as countries would know what they were getting, to set standards and to set a training program and a verification process. Things progressed pretty much as normal until the earthquake in in Haiti, there was a growing concern that medical teams had not been following the standards, if you like, established by search and rescue teams in classifying teams and in setting standards and in a verification system. When the earthquake in Haiti occurred in 2010, there was a large outpouring of medical assistance. I work at the University of Manchester, and our UK Med, the NGO that I founded, is hosted by the university. It's independent of the university, but sits in the university within the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, an academic institute I co-founded that does research and teaching into these issues. And so we sent a team, a surgical team there for 3 months, and then 3 months later sent a research team, in a French-speaking research team, to interview the survivors. And we found a great variation in the standard of care being offered, and in particular surgical care. We found that amputation rates range from 5% or less for the very experienced teams, but greater than 45% and up to 85% for the less experienced teams. That is, they were not doing any limb salvage surgery. But we didn't know whether this was because that was not possible or whether or not they were unable to do it because they were not properly trained or qualified. But they weren't making medical records. The experienced teams were. They had medical records. They were accountable. The WHO knew they were there. The government knew they were there. But many teams, too many teams, were not making medical records, were not getting informed consent, and were not registering themselves with appropriate authorities so they could be accountable. And so other teams found similar things. And so a meeting of experts was established by Pan American Health Organization later that year. A foreign medical teams working group was established to set standards. I was elected its first chair, and we came up with the Blue Book, a classification of minimum standards for foreign medical teams. Later, we also, the WHO worked with the ICRC to produce standards and guidance for the management of limb injuries during disasters and conflicts. So things started to improve enormously. The Blue Book has actually been revised and updated last year, and you can download all these publications from the WHO website. I would remind you, when you're preparing to go, think of what's actually needed. There's obviously the direct consequences of the event, which you can see in the thick black line. If it's an earthquake, for example, then that limb injuries will be the main surgical need. But quickly, as you will see in the dotted line above that, then other emergencies will start to come in. They don't stop, the coincidental emergencies continue. And while elective surgery stops immediately, the sudden event occurs, then you have to catch up with that. And so there is this triple approach, and it is across all emergencies, even whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a war, whether it's a sudden disaster. There are these three elements that will always need to be addressed. Slightly different in conflicts, as you will be aware. There is one sudden event in a sudden onset disaster, but in conflicts, there are a series of outbreaks of violence that adds further stress to the healthcare system, repeated stresses, but there is still that dotted line of unrelated surgical emergencies that will continue to present, and we must be prepared to deal with them. So just to remind you of that, the treatment of the direct consequences of the incident is important. Coincidental emergencies, particularly obstetric emergencies, they continue. And the WHO requires emergency medical teams, no matter what or where they are, to what they are responding or where they are responding, to have the capability to deal with obstetric emergencies and to deal, in particular, to be able to do an emergency cesarean C-section. And if you look at the publications by MSF and elsewhere, you will find a lot of the surgery they are doing in conflicts is not directly related to gunshot wounds or blast injuries. It is actually dealing with general surgical emergencies in the population where the health service has been disrupted, and in particular dealing with maternal emergencies. And then there are the chronic conditions that still need to be managed and dealt with. And this is reflected in the EMT classification system, which I urge you to familiarize yourself with if you're looking to deploy, because the EMT initiative is not confined to civilian teams. The principles and practice we hope will apply across all emergency medical teams in all contexts. And we would encourage the military teams to look at going through this process of verifying their procedures. As far as I'm aware, the only military team to have done so far is the Israeli Defense Force, and they went through the classification system and were verified as a type 3 team. And then we have the recommendations for training, which if you're going to respond to any of these disasters, including conflicts, the first thing to do is to make sure you are fully trained in your specialty, obviously, but then you need adaptation training. How do you adapt those skills to the contingencies of the arena that you will now find yourself in? And then the third part of training is deployment training, where you'd learn to work with your team and do mock deployments. And at my team, UK Med, for example, that's the basis of our training, and it's what WHO recommends. Civ military collaboration, those of you in the military will know this, there are the Oslo guidelines, which that foreign military and civilian defense assets should be requested only when there is no comparable civilian alternative, and only the use of military or civil defense assets can meet a critical humanitarian need. That's important. But I deployed with my team to the typhoon in the Philippines in 2013. And in fact, we did deploy with the British military with the at the request of the Philippine government, and there were Philippine military on the British warship as well, because there was no alternative that would get aid to some of the most remote islands, given their distance, and that other assets were already deployed elsewhere, and there was a British ship in the area. So it was considered that we were compliant with the Oslo guidelines, and the civilian humanitarian team, my team, deployed on HMS Daring, and then another team went on HMS Illustrious to supply emergency humanitarian assistance across the South China Sea. But when humanitarian teams have deployed with the military elsewhere, there have been problems. In Iraq, in Mosul, fairly recently, 2017, there was a request to WHO for humanitarian support, but the Iraqi authorities insisted that the humanitarian teams were embedded with the military, and therefore the Red Cross, MSF, that would not be compliant with their humanitarian principles, and they couldn't respond. And the only way WHO could get humanitarian teams, or to get medical teams to go there, was to actually directly commission and contract teams to go, one of which was a private healthcare company. This raised considerable concerns within the humanitarian community, and WHO commissioned Johns Hopkins to do a review. And what they found was that the WHO had emphasized the humanitarian imperative, the first humanitarian principles, to save lives. But this was over the other principles, such as independence, neutrality, and perhaps impartiality. And they went one step further and said medical teams working directly with a combatant force should not be identified as humanitarian groups. So even if doing the right thing, they're helping people, it is not humanitarian because it does not conform to all the humanitarian principles. These issues have not been resolved, and in responding to conflicts, we need to be cognizant of this. In response to this, the WHO now brought together MSF, ICRC. I helped edit this book, and we've now published a guidance document for medical teams responding to health emergencies in armed conflicts and other insecure environments, which is to be read alongside the Blue Book. And I would again encourage you to download this from the website and consider its contents. My work, to bring it to a close, has been with UK Med, which I founded in the late 80s. It's an international charity that sends medical teams and medical experts to sudden onset disasters and conflicts all around the world. We're working in, I think, 18 countries now. We've just set up an office in Yemen. We've also been responding to COVID. But it's important that we develop the professionalism in the application of medicine in these humanitarian emergencies. And to this end, working with the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, we've established a faculty of remote, rural and humanitarian healthcare, which is international, and it's open to all healthcare workers who are involved in remote, rural and humanitarian healthcare. And we want to move forwards and develop more training courses, qualifications, and establish broader standards. And I would encourage the international community, which I'm addressing now, to look at the faculty, and please do join us. We need to build this up and work together to develop standards across the international community. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm sorry I had some IT glitches there, but I hope the thrust of what I was saying came over to you. I have reflected on my lifetime of work in this field, and I put it in the book Frontline, which I would, if you are interested and do purchase the book, I would encourage you to do so, because the profits from the book go to UK Med, which is a charity. And so you may gain from the experiences I've had, but you would also support the charity that I established. Thank you very much.